Throughout the entirety of my professional career, I have dedicated the vast majority of my time to the rigorous analysis of financial statements and balance sheets, because my primary objective has always been to deeply understand what factors contribute to the creation of genuine and durable value that can sustain a business over decades versus what is merely a temporary flash of success that evaporates as quickly as it appears. There are many things in the business world that look impressive for a moment but lack the substance to survive. However, the most fundamental principle I have learned over all these years is something that transcends any calculated number or financial ratio, and that is the absolute nature of trust in the world of business. Trust is not simply a pleasant emotion or a soft concept. It is quite literally the single most valuable asset. An organization can possess the most successful partnership I ever experienced was the one I shared with Charlie Munger, which lasted for many decades. This partnership did not endure because we agreed on every single decision. Indeed, we often had differing viewpoints, but it lasted because we shared a foundational commitment to integrity, and our loyalty to one another was mutual. It was a two-way street where both parties understood that the other would never sacrifice the relationship or the partner for the sake of a short-term gain or temporary advantage. However, there is another structural dynamic that I have observed many times in the corporate world which superficially resembles a partnership, but in reality it is nothing of the sort. It is fundamentally a one-sided transaction. In this scenario, one party demands absolute and total loyalty, while the other party provides it in the hope that their submission will purchase them some degree of safety or access to power. The inherent flaw in this type of arrangement is that loyalty is only valued by the dominant party for as long as it remains useful. The very moment that the cost of maintaining that loyalty exceeds the perceived benefit, the person in charge will cut their losses without a second thought. There is no hesitation, no severance package, and no golden parachute provided, just an abrupt end to the relationship, because the utility has expired. What we have recently witnessed regarding the news from Washington concerning Mike Johnson does not come as a surprise to me. From my perspective, this is not a sudden or unpredictable political crisis, but rather the predictable conclusion of a high-risk and highly leveraged investment strategy. Mike Johnson, like many individuals who came before him, effectively wagered his entire reserve of political capital not on a specific ideology or the broad interests of a party, but rather on a single individual. He failed to diversify his position, and he did not hedge his bets. Instead, he effectively purchased a single stock with his entire net worth, and now he is facing a margin call that he simply cannot meet. The current disarray that everyone is discussing within the Republican Party looks to me exactly like a forced liquidation event in financial markets. This is precisely what happens to a company that is over-leveraged when the creditors finally arrive to demand payment. When you construct an organization based on the principle of compliance rather than collaboration, you may indeed achieve compliance for a time, but you will never achieve stability, because fear is a very ineffective motivator for the long term. Fear causes people to focus entirely on protecting themselves rather than on building long-term value for the institution. This situation is not merely about Mike Johnson as an individual. It serves as a stark signal to everyone else who remains within that organization that their loyalty is viewed as a disposable asset. When a CEO or a leader sends such a message, the inevitable result is that people stop trusting one another, and that erosion of trust is far more dangerous than any amount of financial debt, because it is the very seed of institutional collapse. When trust departs from an organization, it does not leave behind a neutral vacuum. It is immediately replaced by a far less efficient and far more corrosive motivator, which is fear. I have watched this specific pattern destroy companies that were once considered the gold standard in their respective industries, and the rot always begins at the top, when a dominant shareholder or a chief executive officer begins to treat long-serving and loyal executives as if they are disposable items. It sends a chilling signal throughout the entire ranks. It tells everyone remaining that loyalty is not, in fact, a long-term asset to be cultivated, but rather a short-term transaction to be exploited. The operating principle of the organization shifts dramatically. It stops being about how we can collectively build value and becomes entirely focused on the question of what you have done for me lately. When that shift occurs, the best people, the ones who are truly talented and possess integrity, will leave because they have other options available to them. However, the ones who stay undergo a change. They stop thinking about what is right for the company or the institution and start thinking exclusively about their own survival. This leads to a significant amount of behavior focused on covering one's own tracks, where people spend more time documenting their decisions to avoid potential blame than they spend actually making good decisions for the future. This is exactly what I am observing in Washington right now. The disarray is not random chaos. It is the predictable result of a culture defined by fear. People are more worried about a social media post at dawn than they are about the consequences of a government shutdown. They are more concerned with how an action will appear on cable news than whether it actually solves the underlying problem. And that is a recipe for catastrophic organizational failure. Mike Johnson, by all accounts, believed he was entering into a partnership, but he made a classic error in judgment. He failed to distinguish between temporary favor and a permanent partnership. In investing terms, Johnson thought he was purchasing a high-grade corporate bond, which is an instrument that provides a safe and predictable return. He believed that his unwavering loyalty would pay a steady coupon over time, but what he actually bought was a highly speculative out-of-the-money call option. This type of instrument offers the illusion of a massive potential payoff, but it possesses no underlying durable value. It was entirely dependent on the volatile sentiment of a single person, and in the end, that option simply expired worthless. The disarray you are seeing is simply the sound of an entire organization realizing that their own options might be worthless as well. This widespread realization that loyalty goes unrewarded and that political options are worthless creates what we call systemic volatility in markets. Volatility is not just about prices going down. It is fundamentally about uncertainty and the inability to predict the future. When an organization is gripped by this kind of uncertainty, it becomes paralyzed. In the world of professional investing, we have a specific and very serious term for the situation described previously, and we call it key man risk. This concept represents the single biggest red flag for any serious long-term investor, because it identifies a critical vulnerability where an entire company's success, its strategic direction, and its very survival are dependent on one single individual rather than a robust system. If that one person leaves, the organization falls ill, or simply decides to change their mind, the entire structure is liable to collapse, and there is no safety net to catch it. Smart investors absolutely hate this kind of risk because it introduces an unacceptable level of unpredictability into the equation. Instead, we look for companies with deep benches of talent and strong, durable cultures that function based on established principles rather than being driven by the volatile personalities of a few leaders. The whole purpose of building Berkshire Hathaway was to create a robust system that would outlast both myself and Charlie, because the culture itself is the asset, not the specific men who started it. However, what we are currently observing in Washington is the exact opposite of this sound investment philosophy. The Republican Party, as it is currently structured, has not taken steps to diversify this risk, but rather it has concentrated it to a dangerous degree. The organization has intentionally made itself entirely dependent on the whims, preferences, and daily pronouncements of one person, and the downstream effects of this decision are devastating when everyone in an organization is operating in a defensive mode. Long-term planning becomes effectively impossible. One must ask why anyone would try to solve a complex problem like the federal budget or border security issues that require months of careful negotiation. If the keyman could render all that work obsolete with a single social media post, the answer is that you would not do it. Instead, you would do nothing and wait to be told what to do, which is exactly what we are seeing today. This is not a party in disarray because it is full of incompetent people. It is in disarray because the system actively punishes competence and discourages independent thought. Mike Johnson, predecessor Kevin McCarthy, learned this lesson the hard way as he was removed for the crime of preventing a government shutdown, which is the basic fundamental job of a speaker. Johnson is now facing the same penalty. He was not finished for failing at his job. He was finished for attempting to govern and keep the system running. This is a system that actively rewards confrontation and penalizes practical problem solving. It is an organizational structure designed for failure. When an organization culture becomes this toxic, and when it punishes adaptation while rewarding only total compliance, you invariably see a second-order effect, which is a race to the bottom in terms of talent in any healthy organization. You need people who can tell you the truth even when it is uncomfortable. You need systems that value results over loyalty tests. I have always tried to surround myself with people who will tell me when they think I am wrong. Charlie did it all the time, and I was grateful for it because none of us are infallible. However, when the operating principle becomes compliance at all costs, you stop attracting the best and brightest minds. The truly talented people who have integrity and options will not work in that environment. They leave. So what are you left with? Typically, you are left with two types of people: those who cannot get jobs elsewhere and those who are very good at playing office politics but not very good at actually doing the work. I remember observing a company back in the 1980s. I will not mention the name, but it was run by a very domineering and charismatic CEO. He was brilliant at selling the vision, but he could not tolerate dissent. If anyone questioned him, they were gone. So what happened eventually? All the smart people who would push back and say, "Wait, I think there is a problem here," they all left. What remained were people who just said yes to everything. Within a few years, that company made some catastrophic decisions that led it straight to bankruptcy because there was nobody left in the room willing to say this is a bad idea. They had all seen what happened to people who spoke up. The finishing of Mike Johnson coming right after the removal of Kevin McCarthy sends that exact message to everyone in the organization. Do not speak up, do not adapt, do not govern, just comply. This is not just disarray. It is a systematic hollowing out of the institution, talent, and its capacity to function now. This internal decay and this hollowing out of competence does not stay internal for long. Eventually, it spills out and begins to destroy the organization's most valuable and most fragile asset, which is its reputation. I have spent my entire career building the reputation of Berkshire Hathaway, and it is worth more than all our buildings and factories combined. It is the trust that people have in us to keep our word, to deal fairly, and to think for the long term. That reputation is built in tiny increments over decades, but it can be destroyed in an instant. What we are seeing now with this disarray is the public catastrophic destruction of reputational capital. Think about it in business terms. What if a blue-chip company like an IBM or a Coca-Cola was in the headlines every single day, not for its products, but for its boardroom drama? What if its executives were constantly being fired in public? What if it failed to make payroll, that is, effectively what a government shutdown is. It is the literal failure of the organization to make payroll and meet its obligations in the corporate world. If a CEO announced they were refusing to negotiate and would therefore miss payroll, the board would hold an emergency meeting, and that CEO would be gone by lunchtime. It is a non-negotiable fundamental crisis. Yet in Washington, it has been normalized and is discussed as a strategy. Mike Johnson was caught in the middle of this impossible equation. Mike Johnson was the executive stationed on the ground, trying to prevent this exact crisis from unfolding and attempting to keep the business operations running smoothly. But in order to accomplish this fundamental task, he was forced to go against the explicit demands of the dominant keyman, shareholder. His finishing was not merely an internal personnel decision, it served as a very public signal that the priority of the organization is not to function effectively, not to meet its payroll obligations, and not to serve its customer base, which in this case happens to be the American people. Instead, the overriding priority is total and absolute compliance with the wishes of one single person when an organization sends that specific message. It is effectively broadcasting to the entire world that it is unstable, unreliable, and fundamentally broken. The disarray that everyone is observing is simply the moment when the public finally recognizes the institutional failure that has been rotting inside the structure for years. In the discipline of investing, one of the most critical skills a person must master is learning to distinguish between noise and signal. Noise consists of all the daily fluctuations, the sensational headlines, the manufactured drama, and the endless stream of social media posts. It is designed to capture your attention and to force you to react emotionally without thinking. The signal, on the other hand, is the underlying trend, the fundamental data that actually matters for the long-term trajectory. Right now, Washington is producing a tremendous amount of noise. The headlines are entirely focused on disarray, chaos, and the political scoreboard of who is up or who is down. But all of that is just the noise. The real signal that I am picking up is far more troubling and profound. The signal is the systematic and deliberate erosion of institutional norms. In a business context, norms are comparable to the unwritten rules of quality control. They are the boring procedural protocols that ensure the product you build today is of the same high quality as the one you built yesterday. They serve as the guardrails. They are what stop a company from shipping a defective product just to meet an arbitrary quarterly target. They are what prevent a chief executive from treating company funds as a personal piggy bank. These norms, such as respecting the constitutional process, ensuring the peaceful transfer of power, and maintaining the understanding that you do not weaponize the apparatus of government against your rivals, are the essential guardrails of a functioning democracy. What we are witnessing right now is not just random disarray. It is the active dismantling of those safety guardrails. We are observing a system where personal relationships now matter significantly more than procedural norms and where fear drives more decisions than hope. When Mike Johnson was finished, the signal sent was not just about him as an individual. It was a signal that the norm of compromise, which is the very foundation of a functioning legislative body, is now viewed as a fireable offense. It communicated clearly that the institution of Congress is considered less important than the individual desires of one man. When you build a system around the preferences of one person rather than around durable principles, you are building on a foundation of sand. It might hold together for a while, especially if the weather remains calm. But when the pressure comes, and pressure always comes in politics and business, the whole structure is vulnerable. This is not disarray. It is the inevitable sound of a foundation cracking under the weight of unsustainable principles. I have always believed that incentives are one of the most powerful forces in the business world because you inevitably get exactly what you reward. If you reward salespeople for short-term volume, they will sell anything to anyone, even if the deals ultimately bankrupt the company in the long run. If you reward engineers for quietly complying rather than innovating, you will never achieve a breakthrough product right now. The incentive structure in Washington is completely upside down. The system does not reward problem solving, it does not reward fiscal responsibility, and it certainly does not reward compromise. In fact, it brutally punishes those behaviors. Think about the incentives created by the finishing of Mike Johnson. The message is crystal clear. If you negotiate with the other side, you risk your entire career. If you act independently to prevent a chance national crisis like a government shutdown, you are seen as disloyal, your usefulness dips, and you become a liability. So what does a rational actor or another lawmaker in that organization do? When faced with this specific incentive structure, they do exactly what they are being told to do. They stop taking risks, they stop negotiating, and they stop trying to govern effectively. They simply try to survive the environment. This disarray is not chaos. It is the logical and predictable outcome of a system of perverse incentives. It is an organization filled with people who are just trying to avoid being the next person fired. I have always said that inaction is a decision. When you choose not to act, you are still making a choice, and right now we are watching an entire organization choose inaction because the personal cost of taking action has become too high. The problem with this dynamic is that while the organization remains frozen in fear, the problems facing the country do not go away. They compound. The national debt gets larger. The border crisis does not solve itself, and the threat of a government shutdown looms constantly. But addressing any of these complex issues requires someone to take a risk that the system has just proven can be career-ending. That is the very definition of a broken institution. It is when the personal cost of doing the right thing is higher than the cost of doing nothing. You have created a framework that guarantees failure. This pattern and this finishing of Mike Johnson sends a chilling message that extends far beyond just one man. It is a lesson in institutional power, and it is being taught with brutal efficiency. The lesson being taught is that your usefulness to the leadership is strictly transactional in nature. You could potentially vote alongside the leader on every single occasion, defend him during every crisis, and sacrifice your own public credibility for the sake of partisan gain. However, if your perceived political value falls even slightly below his expectations, or if you make a single move that is interpreted as independent thought, you are liquidated immediately. There is no notice period given, no severance package offered, and you are simply gone. This message spreads with incredible speed throughout the Capitol. Right now, Capitol Hill is populated by lawmakers who are realizing that their entire political futures are tethered to an endotterplake individual who holds no long-term commitments to them personally. This is a deeply uncomfortable realization for anyone to have. It is comparable to working for a corporation where the chief executive officer is notorious for firing employees based on momentary whims, where the loyal employee of today becomes the scapegoat of tomorrow. I have witnessed companies that operate in this manner, and they rarely survive for very long. The reason for their failure is simple. When a culture of fear takes hold, the behavior of every individual becomes distorted. People stop prioritizing the long-term health of the organization and start thinking exclusively about their own short-term survival. They become extremely risk-averse. They stop speaking up when they notice something is wrong, and they focus entirely on staying out of the line of fire. The disarray we are currently seeing in the Republican Party is not a sign of a healthy or robust debate. It is the sound of an organization immune system attacking itself. The very people who are supposed to be governing, such as the Speaker of the House, are being identified as problems for the simple act of attempting to do their job. This is not just personal conflict, it is institutional failure. It signals to every Republican that loyalty is not an asset with a fixed return. Instead, it is speculative like options trading, and as Mike Johnson just found out, that is a very dangerous game to play when the House controls all the rules. When the energy of an organization turns inward in this fashion, it marks the beginning of the end in a healthy and functioning company. 99% of the focus is directed outward. It is focused on the needs of the customer, on the actions of the competition, and on the quality of the product. However, in a toxic culture, the dynamic flips completely, and 99% of the energy is focused inward. The focus shifts to determining who is currently in favor, who is on the outside, and how one must navigate the treacherous internal politics simply to survive the day. The disarray we are seeing is the audible sound of an escalated organization that has become completely consumed by its own internal drama. I recall evaluating a company for potential investment many years ago, and on paper it appeared to be a strong candidate with good revenue streams and decent profit margins. However, when I spoke to the employees working there, I heard the same complaint over and over again. They told me that they spent more time managing internal politics than they did managing the actual business operations. That was a massive red flag for me, and I decided not to invest. Sure enough, within a few years, a competitor who was obsessed with serving customers entered the market and completely overtook them. This is the exact pattern we are seeing in Washington. The finishing of Mike Johnson is the ultimate example of this dynamic. The central debate was not about whether the budget was good for the country or whether the deal prevented a crisis. The central debate was simply whether the move was politically loyal enough to one person, when the primary metric for success is no longer about serving the customer but rather about pleasing the CEO. The organization is already doomed. The disarray is merely the symptom, while the disease is an organization that has forgotten who it works for. Federal workers, who are the employees, face missed paychecks. The American people, who are the customers, face disrupted services. The markets, which represent the investors, sense uncertainty. All of this stems from an organization that is more focused on its own internal power struggles than on its fundamental mission. That is not just disarray, it is a profound betrayal of organizational purpose in the world of business. When you face a genuine crisis, you do not exacerbate the situation by refusing to engage or negotiate. You find a solution and you protect the institution at all costs. I remember vividly the financial crisis of 2008, where many difficult decisions had to be made. People had to set aside their pride, set aside their political preferences, and work together to prevent a total collapse of the system. It was not pretty, and it was certainly not perfect, but it was absolutely necessary. The people who led through that crisis did not do it by digging in their heels and refusing to talk to the other side. They did it by focusing on the core problem and protecting the institution. What we are seeing now is the opposite of that approach. The finishing of Mike Johnson is a direct consequence of him attempting to do the bare minimum of institutional protection, which was keeping the government funded. Mike Johnson was facing what I would describe as an impossible equation. In order to maintain the support of the key man, he would have needed to continue blocking any form of cooperation. This would have meant prolonging the shutdown, deepening the dysfunction, and reinforcing the narrative that his organization is incapable of governing in business terms that is equivalent to refusing a deal that would save your company just to please one large shareholder while your customers walk away in disgust. On the other hand, if Johnson did his actual job, which involves negotiating, governing, and restoring function, he would provoke a backlash from the most ideological elements of his own organization and more. importantly from its key man, that is, the trap. This represents a disarray of purpose rather than policy. It is a framework where winning is impossible when you create a system where doing your job competently results in punishment. You will quickly end up with an organization full of people who either cannot or will not do their jobs, and that is the very definition of a failed enterprise. I have been frequently asked to provide my perspective on what will likely transpire next in this unfolding situation. Honestly, I do not engage in speculation regarding specific political outcomes any more than I would speculate on the stock price of a specific company next month. I am not in the business of making predictions. I am in the business of pattern recognition, and based on the historical patterns I have observed over decades of analyzing organizations, when a corporate culture becomes this toxic and its structure becomes this fragile, you tend to see a few predictable outcomes emerging with regularity. First, you will witness constant and exhausting turnover. People come into the organization, they attempt to navigate the impossible terrain and satisfy the contradictory demands placed upon them. And inevitably they fail to do so. Consequently, they either leave of their own accord, or, like Mike Johnson, they are finished by the system, then someone new comes in to replace them, and the entire destructive cycle repeats itself from the beginning. Think about how much energy and how much institutional capital has been expended just on the process of electing a speaker in the last few years in a business context that is equivalent to a company spending half its time and resources simply selecting a new chief executive officer over and over. Again, it is an incredibly expensive process because every transition results in lost institutional knowledge, broken relationships, and wasted time getting new people up to speed that represents energy that is not being spent on actually serving the customer or solving real problems. Second, you see the race to the bottom that I mentioned earlier. As the truly competent people are purged or choose to leave, the talent pool significantly degrades. The criteria for success is no longer competence or skill, but rather 100% compliance. This disarray is not a temporary state. It is a new lower-level equilibrium where the organization stabilizes at a far lower level of functionality. Third, and perhaps most dangerously, you see escalating dysfunction that eventually forces a major correction. Sometimes that correction comes from outside pressure, such as market forces in business or electoral consequences in politics, but sometimes it comes from an internal collapse when the contradictions simply become too unsustainable to hold. The question is never if a system built on a faulty foundation will fail. The only relevant question is how much damage gets done before it finally happens. What concerns me most about this pattern is not any single politician or any individual decision. It is the profound erosion of the institution itself. In business, we talk about brand value and reputational capital. These are not just fuzzy or abstract ideas. They are real, tangible assets that show up on balance sheets. They represent the trust that customers, employees, and investors have in you. Governments possess these same assets, although we call them trust, legitimacy, stability, and predictability. When those assets erode, they do not come back quickly, and the cost of rebuilding them is enormous. The finishing of Mike Johnson and the disarray it reveals serves as the public burning of that reputational capital it tells the world. And by the world, I mean other countries and global markets, that the organization is unstable. It signals that its commitments are unreliable and that its leadership is subject to sudden and unpredictable purges based on personal whims. One must ask how anyone can negotiate a long-term trade deal or form a strategic alliance with an organization like that. The answer is that you cannot, because the risk is simply too high. You are essentially making a deal with a partner who might not be there tomorrow, replaced by someone with a completely different agenda, all because of an internal loyalty test. This is exactly what I mean by institutional decay. It is when the institution itself, along with its procedures and norms, becomes weaker than the personalities operating within it. I have lived through many political cycles, and I have seen good leaders and bad leaders on both sides. But what I am observing now feels distinctly different. Not because the stakes are higher as they have always been high, but because the institutional guardrails that are supposed to protect the system from any one individual seem weaker than they have ever been in my lifetime. The irony is that the people most responsible for this disarray probably do not see it as dysfunction at all. They likely view it as strength, holding firm to principles and refusing to compromise. But in my world, there is a very big difference between principle and rigidity. Principles are about knowing what matters and being willing to negotiate on everything else. Rigidity is about refusing to bend on anything, even when bending would serve your larger goals. In business, I have always tried to be principled but flexible. There are certain things Berkshire Hathaway will never compromise on, such as integrity, honesty, and dealing fairly with our partners. Those are non-negotiable, however. On almost everything else, such as price structure and timing, we are willing to negotiate and adapt to the circumstance. That flexibility has been crucial to our success. If I had insisted on having my way on every single deal, we would have missed countless opportunities and made enemies instead of partners. The same logic applies to government. There are core values worth defending without compromise, such as constitutional rights and the rule of law. But most of what government does is technical, practical problem-solving questions about how to fund agencies or how to balance competing priorities do not have one single pure moral answer. They require negotiation, compromise, and the recognition that people of good faith can disagree. What troubles me about the current situation is that this kind of practical problem-solving has become nearly impossible because everything has been elevated to a test of loyalty. The budget is no longer just a budget, it is a referendum on your allegiance, and negotiation is seen as betrayal when you frame everything in such absolute and rigid terms. You make governance impossible. The cost of that impossibility does not fall on the people playing the game. It falls on the ordinary people, the federal workers, and the families who just need the system to work in business. I have always believed in facing reality. However uncomfortable it might be, bad news does not get better with age, and the sooner you acknowledge a problem, the more options you have to fix it. The longer you pretend everything is fine, the fewer your options become until you are left with none. By the time a crisis becomes undeniable, it is often too late to avoid serious damage, and you are forced into triage mode instead of prevention mode. Triage is always more expensive, more painful, and less effective than prevention. What we are seeing with this disarray is an organization that is deep in triage mode. The problems were visible for a long time, but they were not being addressed because addressing them would require the very kind of leadership and compromise that the system now punishes. The finishing of Mike Johnson is the perfect example of this. He saw the bad news of the impending shutdown and tried to prevent it moving from denial into action. For that, the organization attacked him, treating him as the problem rather than the problem solver. When you create a system that punishes the people who deliver bad news, you stop hearing bad news, but you do not stop having bad news. It just goes underground where it festers and compounds. This creates massive blind spots for the leadership, allowing the organization to drive straight toward a cliff, while everyone is incentivized to ignore the danger. This disarray is the sound of the car finally hitting the guardrail. It is the moment where reality can no longer be ignored, but the organization has become so dysfunctional that it focuses on blaming the person who tried to grab the wheel rather than the cliff edge itself. When an organization reaches this point, it begins to suffer from institutional amnesia. It actively forgets how to perform its most basic functions, such as governance, negotiation, and long-term planning. These are learned skills built up over years of practice, but when the incentive system rewards only loyalty, those skills atrophy. What remains is an organization that looks the same from the outside but has become a hollow shell. It is like a factory that has fired all its experienced engineers and replaced them with charismatic speakers who know nothing about running the machines. The finishing of Mike Johnson is the final tragic lesson in this process. He was one of the last people who tried to prove the machine still worked, and for doing so he was removed. The message is clear: do not try to govern because it is not worth the risk. I have often said that in investing you should be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful. A similar principle applies here. You should be most concerned about institutional health when everyone else is focused only on short-term political wins. The finishing of Mike Johnson is a perfect example of political quarterly capitalism, where the short-term satisfaction of punishing someone for perceived disloyalty is prioritized over the long-term health of the institution. The cost was the further erosion of the ability to govern and another signal to the world that the organization is unstable. You cannot build durable long-term value in a company or a country on a foundation of short-term emotional reactions. The disarray we see today is a direct result of the disarray from yesterday, creating a vicious cycle that reinforces itself. Breaking this cycle requires someone with enormous courage to step outside the system and risk their career for the good of the institution. But the current system is designed to eliminate exactly those people. Mike Johnson tried to be that person, and the system finished him for it. So who is left to break the cycle? This is the most dangerous part of the pattern. The organization has become so insular that it has lost the ability to self-correct. In business, a board of directors would intervene. But in politics, that destrally, correction is much slower, coming only from voters. In the meantime, the organization continues to spiral, fueled by pride and the belief that the rules do not apply to them. I see a lot of that pride in Washington right now, an organization so convinced of its own righteousness that it believes it can break the fundamental rules of governance without consequence. The finishing of Mike Johnson is the ultimate expression of that pride, declaring that the act of governing is secondary to ideological purity. As an investor, if I saw a company behave this way, I would run. I would sell my stock immediately, because that company is signaling that it is no longer a rational entity. It has become a vehicle for ego and is willing to self-destruct to serve it. This is the pattern that precedes a total collapse. When the institution stops caring about its own survival and cares only about its own internal power dynamics, the disarray is what it looks like when an organization has lost its purpose and has forgotten who it works for. The damage we are watching is not a simple product recall. It is a full-blown crisis of integrity, destroying the one thing you cannot buy, which is trust. And in business, just as in life, that is the one asset you can never truly buy back once it is gone.